Hello everybody, my name is Daniel Medina. The topic of my paper and my presentation is censorship, more specifically, managing content in a school library. I chose this topic because I feel that just like all libraries have to deal with censorship and intellectual freedom and issues such as that, I feel that school libraries might have a little bit more of a difficult time when it comes to this, just because they're responsible for other people's children, students, and minors. So I thought this would be an interesting topic to delve into, and so this is why I chose it. To start things off, I'd like to go over a brief definition of censorship and intellectual freedom as it pertains to the topic of this paper and presentation. So we start with intellectual freedom. Intellectual freedom is freedom that allows people to think about or study what they want. Pretty straightforward definition, and it's something that we've discussed in class before. And then when it comes to censorship, there's multiple definitions of censorship, but the one I found that pertains most to this paper, this topic that we will be going over, was that censorship in libraries is the suppression or prohibition of any parts of books, films, news, and etc. that are considered obscene, politically unacceptable, or a threat to security. Moving forward, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of censorship and the library, just to get an idea of what we're up against as we go further into this topic. A.H. Thompson once said that censorship in public libraries is as old as the public library movement itself. And that statement sort of tells us that because censorship in libraries is as old as the libraries itself, it's something that we will always have to deal with as long as we're talking about the library field and information science field. Um, Library committees had a particularly strong hold on the selection of items for collections pretty much up until after the Second World War, and this was an obstacle for professional librarians as they found this censorship very difficult to overcome. World War II eventually brought about a drop in the number of cases of censorship in libraries. However, there were still instances where censorship was prevalent, such as the defense authorities requesting that maps only be issued to people whose motives are unquestionable. So that kind of shows you a little bit about how unreasonable some of this censorship was post-World War II. Moving on, during the early 50s, the Cold War, which we're all a bit familiar with, I'm sure, led to censorship of socialist and left newspapers, which is another example of censorship and how information was being withheld to the general public. The latter half of the 1950s and the 1960s saw literature that containing sex, violence, and obscenity to become the focus of censorship, which is more or less what we're dealing with these days when we talk about censorship. We're dealing with other aspects of it, but these are the main. This is probably the main focus of most censorship and challenged materials today. Um, and one thing too, librarians of the 1960s and 70s had a tendency to pretend that censorship didn't exist when in fact it did. So this was an issue that wasn't really tackled head on in the 60s and the 70s. Rather, a lot of people kind of turned a blind eye and just kind of allowed books to be censored and not included in certain collections. So part of my paper is going to discuss censorship in school libraries and the Supreme Court and discuss certain landmark cases that dealt with the issue. But one that I want to discuss right now was Island Tree School District versus Pico in 1982. And this was a case that was brought to the Supreme Court by 5 students who challenged their school board's decision to remove 9 specific books from the school library. And I'll go over those 9 titles in just a second. And the Supreme Court eventually stated that local school boards may not remove books from school library shelves simply because they dislike the ideas contained in those books. And the court ended up holding up that school boards do not have unrestricted authority to select library books, and that the First Amendment is implicated when books are removed arbitrarily. And here we have the 9 titles that were involved in that Supreme Court case. You have A Hero Ain't Nothing But a Sandwich, The Best Short Stories by Negro Writers, Soul on Ice, Laughing Boy, Down These Mean Streets, Black Boy, Go Ask Alice, and Slaughterhouse-Five. And those are the 9 titles that brought about the Supreme Court case that we previously just discussed. So, moving along, I'd like to talk about some of the challenges that face school librarians today. Um, well, one of the challenges is that censorship and removal of materials from school library collections across the nation has actually risen significantly in recent decades. So, this is a problem that's not really going away, but actually becoming increasingly more stressful for librarians as they try to figure out how to manage such materials. Um, and in selecting material for inclusion by school library collections, these school librarians have to cater to a range of abilities, cultural backgrounds, developmental stages, and personal interests. So they have to factor in so many different things when deciding which materials to include in their school library collection. They also have to deal with something as simple as picture books that nowadays have a lot more mature content. And some adults are shocked when mature content is presented in these picture books. In schools, another obstacle is that schools act as local parentis, which is Latin for in place of a parent, in regards to the health and safety of a child. But parents often misconstrue this and assume that this extends to the selection of reading material. It doesn't. School librarians have a mandate to support intellectual freedom above anything else. Another issue that sort of blurs the line sometimes for school librarians is self censorship. Um, and sometimes books in school libraries are censored merely by selection. And this is because in school libraries, books can be rejected based on budget, lack of demand, literary quality, limited shelf space, content, relevance to community, and poor reviews. And so sometimes it's very difficult to know when these criteria are used as legitimate selection tools or if they're just being used as an excuse for self censorship. So it kind of, like I said, it kind of blurs the line. In fact, a survey in the School Library Journal showed that 70% of school librarians admitted to avoiding purchasing controversial titles because of fear of parent, administrative, community, and student backlash. And this puts school librarians in a difficult position because while it's an ethical question for them to uphold intellectual freedom, there's been many instances where school librarians have lost their jobs or gotten themselves in trouble because of material that seemed that um, parents or administration or whatnot did not agree with. Also, there were studies done of school districts in Texas and Florida, among other places, which demonstrated a significant lack of holdings of controversial yet award winning and critically acclaimed young adult book titles in these school districts. So, this is probably an example or some sort of evidence of self censorship existing in these school districts. Another form of censorship in school libraries is done through filtering. And these are internet filters to limit websites. You see that page block picture there. That's something that I'm sure we've all seen at some point in our academic careers. The Children's Internet Protection Act of 2001 stated that federal communications funding is dependent on the adoption of an internet policy to guard against images that are obscene, pornographic, or harmful to children. Um, a problem with this is that many schools have created even more extensive policies that block beyond what CIPA requires, including legitimate educational websites that have to deal with religion, LGBT rights, political views, that sort of thing. And also, this filtering also denies students of Web 2.0 tools, such as social media, blogs, gaming sites, and other collaborative learning tools, which in the past were seen as um, just ways for students to waste time. But in this day and age, social media, gaming sites, and blogs are ways in which a lot of students are learning. So, discussing some of the best practices to approach censorship and intellectual freedom, it's important that we write a clear selection policy. And this policy should include selection criteria, review policy, digital access policy, especially, and also include requests for reconsideration of materials from concerned parents, administration, staff, and students to fill out, giving them a voice. Communication with school staff, administration, and parents is extremely important, and possibly group evaluation of the materials to offset personal biases. A lot of times, as librarians, we can possibly find ourselves in a position where we are personally biased against certain material, but by allowing for group evaluation, this may allow us to avoid that. And also involving student participation in purchase suggestions and intellectual freedom focused activities. Um, and also to ensure that challenged material has been read entirely. A lot of times, people challenge materials based on what it's about, the title, some of the pictures, without actually reviewing it. It's important that all challenged material has been thoroughly reviewed and read. Here I just made a list of some of the most challenged books of 2017, just to give you an idea of the wide variety of subject fields and topics that are, censored or challenged every year. Some of these popular ones, 13 Reasons Why, was just turned into a Netflix show last year. The Kite Runner is another popular one, a great book, but it was definitely challenged. Um, to Kill a Mockingbird is another shocking one that's still on the list. So you could kind of go over this list a little bit and just kind of get an idea of what kind of materials are being challenged in libraries today and see that it's a wide variety of topics and subjects. So in closing, some of the debate, some of the questions that I'd like to delve further into in my paper and just questions I'd like to pose to the class. Should certain books be banned from school libraries? Also, does filtering, as terms of internet filtering, does it serve more as a protection for students from inappropriate online material, or does it do more to hinder their learning experiences? And finally, what are some effective management tools that a librarian can use to find a balance between intellectual freedom and serving everybody's needs, including students, parents, staff, and administration? Thank you, everybody, for your time, and I look forward to hearing any feedback.